Most men feel it long before they understand it. The woman sitting across from you today is nothing like the women your grandfather married. Something fundamental has shifted, not just in culture, not just in technology, but in the way she thinks, behaves, reacts, and expects. And here's the uncomfortable hook you've been trying not to articulate. Your frustration isn't insanity, it's clarity trying to break through. While men kept following the same relationship blueprint that worked for generations, the entire operating system on the other side was rewritten without warning. So when you look for competence, you often find confusion. When you seek partnership, you meet entitlement. It's not a coincidence, and it's not bad luck. It's a psychological shift that no one prepared you for. You can test this shift with something simple. Ask a modern woman to do a basic task without digital assistance. Cook a simple meal. Manage a small household chore. Handle something without turning it into a spectacle. You'll see hesitation disguised as humour, irritation wrapped in sarcasm, or immediate deflection. Yet if you ask what she expects from you, the contrast is almost surreal. Height, income, emotional presence, leadership, stability, confidence, kindness, ambition, an ever-expanding list of non-negotiables. And while she lists these requirements, you notice something disturbing. She rarely mentions what she gives in return. A question starts forming inside you, quietly but persistently. When did expectations replace contribution? What has changed isn't simply a loss of practical skills. It's the inflation of perceived value. Women of previous generations didn't view themselves as inherently exceptional. Their worth was built through action, raising families, managing homes, creating stability, carrying weight alongside their partners. They weren't perfect, but they contributed. Today, the cultural narrative has flipped. Women are told they are valuable merely for existing, deserving of praise without effort, loyalty without reciprocity, commitment without sacrifice. And as you stand in front of this new paradigm, you're forced into a silent confrontation. How do you build a relationship with someone who believes the responsibility should fall entirely on you? And here comes the next hook, the one men avoid because it exposes their biggest mistake. The more you compensate for the imbalance, the worse it becomes. You start doing things she won't do. You take on tasks she ignores. You absorb the emotional, financial, and logistical burdens because requesting balance leads to conflict. You become the engine that keeps everything running, yet your effort is treated like background noise, expected, unnoticed, obligatory. When you try to express fatigue, you're framed as insensitive. When you ask for help, you're labelled demanding. When you point out the imbalance, you're accused of being controlling. The system punishes you for trying to fix what's broken. The result is a silent erosion. You become smaller to avoid conflict, quieter to prevent arguments, more tolerant to keep the peace. Meanwhile, she interprets your tolerance as proof that she doesn't need to contribute. Two people stay together, but only one is carrying the relationship, and what once looked like compromise slowly mutates into self-erasure. You don't leave because you're weak. You stay because you hope it will get better. But deep down you already know, this isn't a partnership anymore. It's an arrangement that feeds one side while draining the other. You start noticing how the imbalance creeps in through the smallest moments. It's never a dramatic explosion. It's a slow distortion of roles and expectations until one day you realise you're doing everything, and she's simply there. Every disagreement becomes a referendum on your character. Every unmet need becomes evidence of your shortcomings. If she's overwhelmed, you're unsupportive. If she's insecure, you're inattentive. If she's unhappy, you're failing. Meanwhile, her own contribution is rarely questioned, by her or by anyone else. And while you try to navigate the emotional minefield, a quiet truth begins to echo inside you. This isn't balance, it's blame wearing the mask of partnership. Some men attempt to avoid conflict by taking on even more responsibility. They convince themselves that doing everything is easier than arguing. They rationalize her lack of effort as personality, stress, or modern norms. But the peace they're preserving isn't peace at all, it's submission. Every time you handle a task she refuses to touch, you're teaching her something about the relationship. You're saying, "I'll take care of it. I don't expect anything from you." And she learns that message quickly. When someone realizes they can give nothing and still receive everything, they stop seeing the relationship as a collaboration. They start seeing it as a service. Emotional imbalance becomes the background hum of everyday life. You find yourself tiptoeing around her moods, adjusting your behavior to prevent another emotional storm. You measure every word, anticipate every reaction, soften every truth. You stop expressing your needs because you've learned that your needs create problems, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, you shift from being a partner to being a caretaker. You're still present in the relationship, but you've disappeared from yourself. And a question begins to rise. How long can you keep shrinking before there's nothing left of you? Here's the hook you've probably avoided. Your patience isn't healing the relationship, it's enabling its destruction. The more you try to be understanding, the more she sees you as someone who will absorb every imbalance. The more calm you remain, the more she escalates her demands. Not because she's cruel, but because modern conditioning has taught her to interpret male tolerance as male weakness. So when you finally show exhaustion, she's stunned. She never saw the weight, she only saw your silence. And when your silence collapses, she treats it like betrayal. Many men start mistaking crumbs for love. A rare compliment feels like emotional intimacy. A slightly warm gesture feels like deep affection. You become grateful for the bare minimum because you've been given so little for so long. But gratitude for scarcity is not love, it's emotional dehydration. And by the time you notice, you've already adapted to living in a relationship where you celebrate moments that should have been normal. If these words resonate with the part of you that's been quiet for too long, stay. This space isn't made for comfort, it's made for clarity. One of the most damaging illusions men fall into is believing that lowering their standards is a reasonable trade-off. You convince yourself that expecting less will make things easier, that being less demanding will help the relationship survive. But every time you lower the bar, you lower yourself with it. You start accepting behaviours you once swore you'd never tolerate. You make excuses for things that would have been red flags a few years ago. You normalise patterns that drain you. And before you know it, you're in a relationship where everything you give is invisible and everything she gives is optional. You don't feel valued, you feel used. But you've adapted so gradually that you barely notice the cost. Men often soothe themselves with comforting lies. It's just a phase. She's stressed. Things will get better. And yes, stress exists. Phases happen. But there's a difference between imperfection and entitlement. You feel it when you speak. Every issue you raise is redirected back at you. Every concern becomes a critique of your behaviour. Every attempt at honesty becomes an accusation. You bring facts. She brings feelings. You offer clarity. She offers deflection. The conversation becomes a loop where nothing improves because only one of you believes improvement requires effort. And slowly, you stop trying. Many men have forgotten what a truly balanced relationship even looks like. They've become so accustomed to emotional lopsidedness that the smallest gesture feels enormous. A meal cooked, a thank you said without prompting, a moment of real warmth. These things feel miraculous, not because they are, but because you've been starved of reciprocity for so long. Your perception shifts. What should be normal feels rare. What should be expected feels like a blessing. And that's when the fear creeps in. At what point did you forget what you deserve? Now comes the hook. Sharp, revealing, unavoidable. Most men aren't suffering because of women. They're suffering because of their own fear. Fear of being alone. Fear of starting over. Fear of being unwanted. The modern world has conditioned men to believe they should be grateful for any female attention, that simply being chosen is enough. But gratitude rooted in insecurity isn't love, it's dependency. You stay, not because the relationship enriches you, but because you're afraid of emptiness. And that fear becomes a leash you tighten around your own throat. Respect erodes long before love does. First, she loses respect for you because you accept things no man with a sense of worth would tolerate. Then you lose respect for yourself because you know you've betrayed your own boundaries. And once respect dies, the relationship doesn't end. It decays. It continues out of habit, obligation, and fear. The dynamic shifts from partnership to emotional erosion on a slow drip. You give, she receives. You bend, she leans. And neither of you confronts what's actually happening. You're holding together something that neither of you believes in anymore. The saddest truth is that a man often doesn't realize he's drowning until he breathes clean air again. Only after a breakup, or a temporary separation, or a moment of unexpected peace, does he realize how heavy the relationship had become. Only then does he see how exhausted he truly was. The quiet, the stillness, the lack of conflict, they reveal everything. You weren't loved, you were tolerated, you weren't valued, you were used. And being useful is fine until it costs you your soul. A painful realization settles in once you begin to see the patterns clearly. Many modern women aren't looking for a relationship. They're looking for the benefits of one. They want the security, the emotional support, the financial stability, the masculine presence, without contributing the feminine balance that once made partnership possible. And when you point out the imbalance, you're met with accusations. You're controlling, old-fashioned, too demanding. But what you're asking for isn't a return to the 1950s. It's the most basic ingredient of any functioning union: reciprocity. Yet we live in a culture where any expectation placed on a woman is labelled oppressive, while every expectation placed on a man is labelled the bare minimum. You're still expected to be the rock, the leader, the planner, the protector, the emotional anchor, the provider. You're supposed to be strong without being harsh, sensitive without being fragile, successful without being stressed, available without being needy. It's a checklist that no man in history has ever been able to fulfill perfectly. Yet you're judged as if you're failing simply for being human. And when you fall short, the spotlight always shifts to your flaws, not her lack of contribution. Your imperfections become the narrative. Her limitations become footnotes. Meanwhile, another distortion takes root. Many women have been taught that their desires equal rights, that whatever they feel should immediately translate into reality, and whatever stands in the way is a personal slight against them. They've been conditioned to believe that wanting something is justification enough, and that wanting nothing from themselves is equally acceptable. But you, as a man, don't get the same luxury. You're measured by results, by actions, by consistency. How can you possibly find balance with someone who measures herself by emotions and you by effort? How do you create stability on a foundation where accountability is seen as an insult? And here comes the hook, sharp and cold. You cannot build a real relationship with someone who treats responsibility as an attack. Responsibility is the bridge between two adults. It's what transforms a bond from convenience into partnership. But when your attempt to set a boundary is treated as domination, when a simple, "Can you help with this?" triggers defensiveness, when requests for reciprocity are framed as oppression, you're no longer dealing with an equal. You're dealing with someone who has never had to grow up. And the more you try to build, the more resistance you face, because growth threatens the comfort of entitlement. This is why so many men learn to move silently within their own homes. They stop speaking truths that will be punished. They stop expressing needs that will be dismissed. They stop pointing out patterns that will be denied. What remains isn't peace. It's a quiet form of self-abandonment. When you shrink yourself to maintain the relationship is already over. It just hasn't collapsed yet. If you're still here, it means you're not like most. You're someone who chooses awareness over illusion. This space exists for men who refuse to keep lying to themselves. One of the most corrosive parts of modern relationship dynamics is how respect erodes quietly, long before either person admits something is wrong. It starts with small things. She stops acknowledging what you do, reacts with irritation instead of appreciation, treats your effort as background noise rather than something meaningful. You dismiss it at first. You tell yourself she's tired, distracted, overwhelmed. But something inside you feels the shift. You know respect is the foundation of everything. Without it, affection becomes ritual, intimacy becomes obligation, and love turns into performance. A woman who stops respecting you doesn't need to scream it. Her silence says it for her. Most men don't realize how directly this erosion is tied to their own behavior. When you tolerate imbalance, you teach her that imbalance has no cost. When you handle everything without asking for help, you teach her that your role is to absorb. When you hide your frustration behind a polite smile, you teach her that your strength is endless. And when a woman believes your strength has no limits, she pushes those limits until something breaks. It's not intentional cruelty, it's conditioning. She learned that if you don't enforce your boundaries, you don't have any. Then comes the shift that's hardest to swallow. She begins to treat your presence as guaranteed. What once felt like a partnership slowly turns into an assumption. She assumes you'll handle the bills. She assumes you'll fix the problems. She assumes you'll carry the emotional weight. She assumes you'll always be there, because you always have been. But what she doesn't see is the cost of that constancy. The more reliable you are, the more invisible you become. The more you give, the more she believes she is entitled to receive. And here's the hook for this block. When you start thanking her for doing the bare minimum, you've already forgotten your own worth. This is the moment men rarely recognize until it's too late. You become grateful for scraps because you've been deprived for so long. A small gesture feels monumental. A slight effort feels like devotion. You confuse rarity with value. But the truth is simple. She's giving you the minimum because you've taught her the minimum is enough. And you accept it not because you believe it's right, but because you fear what it would mean to demand more. Once respect dies, the relationship doesn't end immediately. It decays. She stops seeing you as a man and starts seeing you as a utility. Someone who supports her, someone who carries her, someone who absorbs her, but not someone she admires. And when admiration disappears, desire follows. Affection follows, connection follows. You can work harder, give more, sacrifice more. But nothing reignites desire in a woman who no longer respects you. You're no longer her partner, you're her emotional and practical infrastructure. Many men only understand this after they're out, after the breakup, after the divorce, after the quiet returns. Suddenly you feel a peace that startles you. A silence without tension, a day without criticism, a moment where you don't brace yourself emotionally, and that's when it hits you. You weren't in a relationship, you were in a draining agreement. You weren't loved, you were useful. And usefulness without respect is just servitude with a romantic mask. The deepest disillusionment settles in when you compare what you're living with the relationships you saw in older generations. Not because those relationships were perfect. They were often messy, flawed, and far from idyllic, but because they had something modern relationships lack, a sense of mutual responsibility. Men brought one set of strengths, women brought another, and together they created stability. Reciprocity wasn't a luxury, it was the default. Today, however, many relationships feel less like a partnership and more like a quiet competition over who can contribute the least. Love becomes a negotiation of effort instead of a shared investment. Modern culture has trained many women to view any expectation placed on them as a violation of freedom. Ask for cooperation and you're controlling. Ask for maturity and you're oppressive. Ask for contribution and you're sexist. Yet every expectation placed on you, financial support, emotional regulation, leadership, problem solving, is considered normal and non-negotiable. This mismatch creates a relationship where only one person carries the weight, while the other critiques how he carries it. And if the relationship collapses, society automatically assumes the man didn't do enough. This dynamic pushes many men into a survival strategy: adaptation through self-reduction. You stop asking for emotional support. You stop expecting consistency. You stop hoping for reciprocity. Instead, you accept the minimum as if it were generosity. You convince yourself that it's better than nothing, and here lies the trap. When you become accustomed to emotional scarcity, you forget abundance is even possible. You start to believe that a healthy dynamic is unrealistic, that expecting partnership is naive, that wanting reciprocity is demanding too much. Now comes the hook of this block, sharp as a blade. Most men aren't tired of women. They're tired of being the only adult in the relationship. You feel it in your bones. You're the one who solves the problems, manages the emotions, makes the decisions, stays steady when everything around you wavers. You're the one who absorbs the chaos she creates, then gets blamed for the chaos you prevented. What you're in isn't a partnership. It's emotional labor disguised as love. You're not walking beside her. You're carrying both of you while she complains that the journey is uncomfortable. What makes this even more disturbing is that many women genuinely don't see their part in the dynamic. They believe they're contributing because society taught them that showing up is contribution. They think being loyal is effort. They think existing next to you is the same as building with you. But relationships aren't sustained by presence. They're sustained by value. And value isn't a feeling. It's action. It's responsibility. It's showing up not just in proximity, but in effort. What wears men down isn't the work itself. Men have been doing hard things for their entire existence. What breaks them is the loneliness inside the relationship, the sense of being essential but never appreciated, needed but never respected, relied upon but never supported. It's the weight of carrying someone who never learned to walk on their own. When a man breaks in this environment, it happens quietly. No outburst, no explosion. Just a gradual dimming of the light inside him. A slow, silent collapse only he can feel. And once that light goes out, there's no recovering what was lost. A man can rebuild his life, but he never forgets the relationship that drained him enough to destroy his spirit. A sobering truth emerges when you examine the psychological landscape shaping modern women. They've been programmed to want traditional male outcomes without offering traditional female contributions. They still desire strength, competence, provision, emotional stability, and leadership. But they've been taught to reject the feminine roles that once balanced those masculine qualities. They want the benefits of old world relationships with the freedoms of the new world, and they expect men to bridge that contradiction alone. You're told to be the protector, the provider, and the emotional anchor, while she insists her only responsibility is to be herself. But a relationship can't function when one person brings expectations and the other brings excuses. This contradiction becomes even more pronounced when crises arise. When you need support, she often retreats into deflection or emotional chaos. When she needs support, you're expected to be a fortress. Strength in men is viewed as duty. Strength in women is optional. Effort from you is mandatory. Effort from her is conditional. And over time, you internalize this imbalance. You start believing that your role is to absorb everything. Her emotions, her fears, her bad days, her inconsistencies, while downplaying your own. You don't break down because breaking down isn't an option for you. You don't fall apart because falling apart would make you weak. And so, you continue carrying the load, even when the weight becomes unbearable. But here's the hook of this block, the one men whisper to themselves but rarely say aloud. Modern relationships often feel like caring for a partner who expects everything while offering nothing essential in return. It's not that all women are incapable, it's that many have been conditioned to see capability as optional. They've been told independence is empowerment, yet expect dependence from men in every domain that truly matters. They want equality in theory, but privilege in practice, and this mismatch corrodes the foundation of the relationship from the inside out. What follows is predictable. Emotional volatility becomes the norm. Every small inconvenience becomes a crisis. Every disagreement becomes a moral failure. You're expected to stabilize not just the relationship, but her entire internal world. Meanwhile, she feels justified in her chaos because society rewards female emotion and punishes male emotion. She can break down, you must stay composed. She can express anger, you must stay calm. She can demand change, you must adapt. This emotional asymmetry slowly morphs into psychological exhaustion. You begin to anticipate her moods before she expresses them. You adjust your tone, your timing, your presence, all to avoid stepping on invisible landmines. You learn to decode her silence, soothe her anxiety, and manage her reactions, but no one manages yours. You become the emotional firefighter, constantly extinguishing flames you didn't start, and with each fire you lose a little more of yourself. Eventually resentment creeps in, not loud, not explosive, but quiet and corrosive. A whisper that grows, "What about me?" But you silence it, because voicing it leads to conflict, and conflict leads to accusations, and accusations lead to consequences you don't have the energy to deal with anymore. So you swallow your needs again and again until they disappear. And the relationship becomes a place where you survive, not a place where you live. There comes a moment, usually quiet, usually unexpected, when the truth finally settles inside you. It happens in the stillness, when the noise of the relationship fades long enough for you to recognize what you've been carrying. You realize the partnership wasn't a partnership. It was emotional labor wrapped in affection, obligation disguised as love, duty mistaken for connection. You see how long you've been negotiating with yourself, convincing your mind to tolerate what your spirit has been rejecting for years. It's a moment of clarity that feels both liberating and devastating. You were never in a mutual bond, you were in a one-sided arrangement. This revelation isn't born from bitterness. It comes from exhaustion, the kind that settles deep beyond frustration, beyond anger, into a place where the body refuses to lie anymore. You remember the early version of yourself, hopeful, giving, patient, willing to build. You compare him to the man you've become, drained, muted, walking on emotional eggshells, and the contrast is brutal. You didn't lose yourself in one dramatic moment. You lost yourself through 1,000 small compromises. Boundaries you lowered, disrespect you tolerated, need you silenced, all to maintain a relationship that was siphoning the life out of you. And here is the final hook, the truth many men are terrified to confront. Sometimes solitude is not a failure, it's the only path back to dignity. Modern relationships often force you to choose between companionship and self-respect, between having someone beside you and having yourself intact. Most women today have been shaped by entitlement, emotional indulgence, and a culture that praises their desires while dismissing your pain. Finding one who hasn't been consumed by that programming is possible, but rare. And if you don't filter ruthlessly, you will lose years trying to save someone who never intended to meet you halfway. When you finally step back, you start noticing patterns you ignored, the appreciation you never received, the effort you never saw returned, the imbalance you tried to justify, and you recognize something you knew all along. A relationship without respect is a slow death. It doesn't explode, it withers, and no amount of giving can revive what she never valued in the first place. But the most important shift happens internally. You stop apologizing for wanting standards. You stop explaining why reciprocity matters. You stop shrinking yourself to avoid her reactions. You stop twisting your identity into shapes that keep the peace. You finally understand that your worth isn't proven by how much mistreatment you can endure. It's proven by what you refuse to allow. And this is where your life begins again. Not in the arms of a new woman, not in the validation of being desired, but in the quiet recognition of your own value. Once you reclaim that, everything changes. You choose differently. You see differently. You love differently. You walk with a spine again. Subscribe if you're done betraying yourself, if you're ready to stop being drained and start being respected. This channel exists for men who refuse to repeat the same cycle and are ready to reclaim their power,